When Queen Elizabeth passed, the world mourned. But within the walls of Buckingham Palace, something far more explosive than grief was brewing. Behind sealed envelopes and encrypted archives lay a clause handwritten, sealed, and hidden. A clause so controversial, it bypassed King Charles entirely and handed Highgrove not to the heir, but to the heir's heir. Why did the Queen sidestep her own son, and why now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment the Queen's personal vault was opened, silence swept through the corridors of power. Among the collection of her final wishes, private correspondences, and symbolic heirlooms was a single document no one anticipated. It wasn't stamped with a government seal or drafted by palace legal counsel. It was handwritten in the Queen's own unmistakable script. Inside, a clause so specific, so deliberate, it left no room for ambiguity. Highgrove House, one of the most cherished royal estates, was to bypass King Charles entirely and be placed directly in the hands of Prince George. The revelation shook those present to their core, especially as the clause bore signatures of 2 loyal witnesses and an archaic royal cipher, indicating it had been locked away for years. The Queen had made her choice long before her passing silently, and with certainty. Whispers spread quickly. Royal aides who laid eyes on the clause reportedly turned pale, stunned by the simplicity of the command and the implications it carried. One name, George, was all it took to ignite panic in rooms long accustomed to control. What made it worse was the absence of any procedural formality. There had been no counsel sought, no conversations with Charles, not even a symbolic nod in his direction. This wasn't just a legal decision, it was a statement, one with implications that could destabilize the emotional foundation of the monarchy. Prince William was the first to discover, while reviewing transition documents pertaining to his son's long-term royal education and estate responsibilities. Tucked between pages of logistical briefs and ceremonial expectations was the clause staring back at him like a ghost from his grandmother's past. His heart reportedly sank, not out of ambition, but from the weight of what the Queen had entrusted to him and to George. This wasn't about property. It was about power, legacy, and a judgment passed down in ink, forever bypassing the man who now wore the crown. Legal experts brought in for consultation didn't hesitate in their verdict. The clause was binding, reinforced by royal prerogative that superseded even the sovereign's current authority. It's ironclad. No reversal, one reportedly said behind closed doors. Panic began to creep into conversations at Clarence House and Balmoral. The Queen had used one of her final acts not to elevate her son, but to overlook him. This wasn't oversight. This was intentional. But why? Rumours began to swirl. Some claimed Elizabeth never fully trusted Charles to protect Highgrove's symbolic place in the royal lineage. Others whispered about her private reservations regarding his long association with Camilla. Still more pointed to the Queen's deeply held admiration for William and Catherine's parenting, their stability, and the calm grace with which they carried the crown's future. It wasn't that she didn't love Charles, it was that she didn't trust the legacy in his hands. But how did this shocking clause remain hidden from the eyes of the future king for so long, and who helped keep it buried? They were called the Silent Circle, a small unit inside the palace known only to a few. Their task, guard the Queen's private directives until the moment came. But when the clause naming George as Highgrove's future holder surfaced, all eyes turned to the operatives behind Operation Obsidian. Who were they loyal to duty, the monarchy, or something more dangerous? It began discreetly, long before the world even suspected the Queen's health was faltering. A covert initiative launched from within the palace. Operation Obsidian was shielded from the public, and even from key senior royals. Only those deemed essential to the monarchy's long-term vision were allowed to know of its existence. This wasn't about safeguarding the crown jewels or handling ceremonial affairs. It was about locking away the Queen's final wishes, the directives she feared would ignite wars within the family if exposed prematurely. And among those orders sat the clause, a bombshell declaration that Highgrove would not pass to her son, the then Prince Charles, but to her great-grandson, George. The implications were seismic, but the execution was clinical, calculated, and devastatingly silent. Insiders now whisper that it was Princess Anne who played a quiet but decisive role in orchestrating this operation. The Queen, deeply trusting of her only daughter's discretion, reportedly tasked Anne with assembling a group of loyalists individu, who had proven their loyalty not to any one monarch, but to the institution itself. Lawyers, clerks, archivists, and even a former intelligence liaison formed the heart of this inner circle. They were bound not just by confidentiality agreements, but by something far more severe, a sacred oath sealed in Windsor Castle's private chapel. Anyone who broke it would be cast out, stripped of all royal ties, and permanently exiled from the Crown's inner sanctum. The documents were hidden in a sealed vault beneath Windsor, accessible only through a biometric protocol reserved for 3 individuals. None of them, shockingly, were King Charles. The Queen had made it clear he was not to know. The reason remained cloaked in speculation, but those close to her now admit that her fear wasn't Charles mishandling the estate. It was what he might do to the balance of power it represented. Highgrove wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of quiet continuity, one that Elizabeth intended to pass not to her successor, but to her successor's successor. And then came the moment of revelation. The vault opened, the claws read, the silence shattered. But as the dust settled, suspicions began to rise. Someone, it seemed, had known far more than they let on. There were whispers, quiet, sharp, and growing louder, that someone from Charles's own circle had known about the claws and said nothing. Was it to protect William? Or was it to ensure that the Queen's final wishes couldn't be intercepted or undone? The betrayal wasn't just from outside, it may have been growing from within. And if Operation Obsidian was built to protect George's future, what does that reveal about the Queen's true feelings, Abu? Charles. For years, Queen Elizabeth remained the picture of discretion, never wavering in public support of her son. But behind closed doors, letters, voice memos, and diary entries paint a different picture, a mother torn between bloodline and legacy. Was the Queen's final move her last act of protection, or a long-awaited reckoning? In the solitude of her later years, Elizabeth began to write more than she spoke. Letters never intended for public eyes revealed what generations had only speculated: that she harboured deep concerns about Charles's vision for the monarchy. Though she loved him as a mother, as a sovereign, she feared what his reign might unleash. The Queen reportedly described her son's direction as overly sentimental, vulnerable to disruption, and less anchored in duty than in emotion. She never said these words aloud to him, but she left them behind, preserved in elegant script, as a warning wrapped in regret. Those closest to her now speak of quiet confessions shared in firelit drawing rooms and long car rides through Balmoral's winding paths. She questioned whether Charles had truly grown into the role destiny assigned him. The issue wasn't his character, it was his choices. Time and again Camilla's presence came up, not just as a partner, but as an influence. The Queen feared that her son, under Camilla's persuasion, might dilute the core of what the monarchy was meant to stand for. One long-time aide confessed that Elizabeth once muttered, "He sees love where he should see legacy." In contrast, she looked at William and Catherine with cautious hope, not just for their youth or image, but for their steady hands and quiet discipline. In her words, they were the future the Crown could trust. She admired their ability to walk in shadows without scandal, to lead without seeking the spotlight. When the decision regarding Highgrove had to be made, it was clear to her who could carry its symbolic weight into the next century, and it wasn't Charles. Highgrove had grown beyond bricks and fields. It had become a representation of generational transition, a place of rooted continuity that she believed only William's branch could nourish. Perhaps most haunting of all were the conversations she had with Prince Philip in the final years of his life. Though often stoic, Philip reportedly agreed with her concerns. According to a confidential note left among her effects, they discussed the possibility of bypassing Charles not for the crown itself, but for the holdings that defined the monarchy's heartbeat. Highgrove, they concluded, should never be treated as a placeholder. It was a sanctuary for future kings, not a temporary stage for a man whose reign, they believed, would always carry the weight of compromise. Among the most intimate discoveries were voice notes addressed to William, tucked inside a sealed box labelled "if needed." In one, her voice trembled not with age but with certainty. "Think beyond titles," she told him. "Think of the crown not as something to inherit, but as something to preserve. One day you will understand why I chose the path I did, and when you do, forgive me for what I protected and for what I withheld." It was a mother's farewell layered with sorrow, pride, and the unmistakable sting of a decision she knew would fracture her family forever. But while William wrestled with the emotional weight of this discovery, Charles's reaction would ignite a storm the monarchy hadn't seen in decades. He waited his whole life to ascend the throne, only to discover that his mother's legacy had already skipped over him. When King Charles learned of the clause, insiders claim he went pale, shaking with rage, demanding immediate action. But it was already too late. The ink had dried. The heir to Highgrove was not him. It was George. The moment the words were spoken aloud in the private legal briefing, time seemed to stop. King Charles, seated in the quiet confidence of inherited authority, was handed a document that shattered it all in one blow. The Queen's clause wasn't a recommendation, it was a declaration, final, binding and devastating. The room fell silent as he read the lines for himself. He blinked, swallowed hard, and then, according to those present, stood so suddenly that the chair toppled behind him. He didn't speak. He roared. In a voice rarely heard beyond royal walls, Charles erupted, veins tight, voice cracked, fury barely contained. He demanded everyone out. All but one advisor were removed from the room. For the first time in years, the King of England was alone with his disappointment. Camilla, when summoned, offered no solace. Her reaction was icy, even biting. She stared at the clause and simply whispered, "You always said she never truly saw you." That single sentence reportedly silenced Charles more than any legal threat. It wasn't the clause alone, it was the vindication of every unspoken suspicion he carried since the day his mother passed. That she had loved him as a son but never fully accepted him as a king. That no matter how long he waited in the shadows, our trust was never entirely his. The following hours inside the palace were tense, suffocating. Charles called for William. Not a gentle summons, but a command. The future king entered the Red Room knowing exactly what storm awaited him. What followed behind those doors remains one of the most volatile confrontations in recent royal history. Eyewitnesses only heard fragments, raised voices, Charles's furious demands, "How long have you known?" and William's restrained, pained response, "I only wanted to protect George." The room, once filled with royal portraits and velvet calm, echoed with the sharp divide between father and son. Two kings, one crowned, one rising no longer speaking as family, but as adversaries on opposite sides of legacy. The aftermath rippled like an earthquake through the royal corridors. Advisors scrambled to assess the legal strength of the Queen's clause. Meetings were held in hushed corners of the palace. Phone calls to barristers were made late into the night. Could it be reversed? Could the monarchy's current sovereign override the will of its former? The answer returned cold. Not easily, and certainly not without public backlash. Any attempt to undo the clause would paint Charles as a desperate father trying to strip a child of his grandmother's final gift. The optics were unbearable. The legality, worse. The crown's image hung in the balance. And yet, in the eye of the storm, one figure remained shockingly composed: Prince William, who had a plan no one saw coming. Torn between two roles, devoted son and devoted father, Prince William found himself at the epicenter of a royal earthquake. Accepting the clause would mean stepping into power early. Ejecting it would dishonor his mother's final will. In his silence, the nation began to wonder what would he choose and who would pay the price. William had always walked the line between deference and duty with quiet precision, but the discovery of the Queen's hidden clause obliterated the certainty he once held. For days he kept the document hidden from everyone, even Catherine. He needed time to think, to weigh the implications, to try and silence the storm building inside him. What he faced wasn't just a political dilemma, it was personal. To act on the clause was to accept his mother's trust but betray his father's fragile authority. To deny it would be to dismiss the very legacy she entrusted to him and to George. The pressure was relentless, and the walls of the palace, once protective, began to feel like a cage tightening around him. In quiet desperation, William turned to the few people he knew could offer guidance without bias or fear. Princess Anne, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, told him bluntly, "Legacy doesn't wait for approval. It demands courage." The Archbishop of Canterbury, privy to the Queen's confessions in her final days, reminded William that silence, too, was a choice, and sometimes the most dangerous one. William listened, but his heart remained torn. The idea that he would be seen as the architect of Charles's humiliation, the very catalyst of his father's unravelling, weighed heavily on his conscience. And yet, in the background of it all was George, innocent, unaware, and unknowingly placed at the centre of a dynastic decision that would haunt the monarchy for decades. That innocence was shattered when George overheard a tense exchange between William and one of his advisers. Later that evening, he quietly asked, "Why is Grandad so angry with you?" The words pierced William's heart. This wasn't just about estates or succession, it was about shaping the world his son would inherit, a world built either on confrontation or stability. William began to consider delaying the announcement, allowing the tension to subside and giving Charles time to accept the new reality with dignity. It was a tempting path, one that might soften the blow, avoid headlines, and preserve whatever remained of their strained bond. But delay was not what his mother had asked of him. It was Catherine who finally shattered the silence. Upon learning the truth, she didn't hesitate. She reminded William of the Queen's unwavering faith in him. "She trusted you, not just as her grandson, but as a guardian of the future. You've always protected your father. Now protect your son. Do what your mother asked." Her words steadied him, even as they exposed the magnitude of what he was about to do. William knew that whatever he decided next, there would be no undoing it. Not just for his family, but for the monarchy as a whole. But while William hesitated, forces inside and outside the palace were already working to shift the balance permanently. No secret in the monarchy stays buried for long. As whispers of the clause leaked beyond the palace gates, battle lines were drawn. Some rallied behind George's inheritance as a modern solution. Others saw it as a constitutional betrayal, and in the shadows, former royals and political elites began taking sides with dangerous intentions. The moment the clause was mentioned beyond the walls of Windsor, a wave of unrest rippled through the aristocratic and political elite. The palace had worked tirelessly to keep the Queen's final directive contained, but power this seismic never stays quiet. Within days, allegiances shifted, calls were made, and decades-old loyalties began to fracture. Princess Anne, stoic and fiercely loyal to the Queen's vision, made her stance public in a closed-door briefing legacy over lineage. That was my mother's belief. And I stand by it. Her words sent a clear message: the future of the monarchy would be defined not by age but by intention. Standing with her was Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, who quietly offered her support to William, stating that George represents the balance the crown desperately needs. Not everyone agreed. Prince Edward remained cautiously neutral. To some it was diplomacy, to others avoidance. "This is a family matter," he said, refusing to be pulled into a war he believed could still be de-escalated. But neutrality became harder to maintain as Camilla began a calculated push behind the scenes. Determined to uphold Charles's symbolic primacy, she lobbied senior aides and sympathetic MPs to frame the clause as an overstep, a breach of trust between sovereign and institution. Her goal was clear: keep Charles at the centre of power, no matter how diminished his moral authority might be. And while she moved quietly, her network was vast. Former advisers, political donors, and royal allies began resurfacing, pressing Parliament to question the legality of allowing such a clause to shape succession at the estate level. Inside Westminster, the panic was palpable. Legal scholars and constitutional historians were summoned to Privy meetings. Would honouring the clause set a precedent that allowed future monarchs to rewrite lines of inheritance at whim? Could the public stomach the idea of a reigning king being bypassed in favour of a child? The debate was no longer confined to drawing rooms and state halls, it was now creeping into the public consciousness. And with every leak, every whispered headline, the monarchy's foundation grew more unstable. Caught in the middle were Beatrice and Eugenie, both of whom found themselves thrust into conversations they hadn't asked for. Charles leaned on them for public support, while William's camp hoped they'd speak to unity and generational vision. Torn between love for their family and pressure from opposing forces, their silence became its own message, a sign of deepening fracture behind the crown's polished veneer. Meanwhile, something strange was happening around Highgrove. Staff rotations accelerated, private security was reassigned, surveillance protocols quietly changed. The official reason was modernization, but those watching closely knew better. Highgrove was no longer just an estate. It was a fortress of meaning, a symbol of Elizabeth's final rebellion, and the world was preparing for the next blow. And just when it seemed the tension couldn't escalate any further, a second hidden clause surfaced, one that made the first look tame. If the first clause stunned the monarchy, the second shattered it. Discovered in a sealed envelope marked "If conflict arises," this clause didn't just name George, it restructured the entire estate's governance. Stripping Charles of executive authority, it handed long-term custodianship of Highgrove to a council led by Cat. Herine, buried deep within the Queen's private collection, the second clause was never intended to see the light of day, unless the first triggered chaos, and chaos had arrived. Labelled in the Queen's own script, the envelope contained not a mere addendum, but a sweeping decree. Highgrove, while granted to George in name, would be placed under the stewardship of a ruling council until he came of age. And heading that council, by direct appointment from Elizabeth herself, was none other than Catherine. The Queen had not only bypassed Charles, but stripped him of any capacity to interfere, command, or revise the property's operations. The message couldn't be clearer. Charles might wear the crown, but the future of her legacy rested elsewhere. Inside the clause, limitations were listed with brutal clarity. Charles was explicitly barred from altering the estate's gardens, trust structure, or staff composition. Even symbolic changes such as renaming buildings or redesigning interiors were prohibited. Legal advisors quickly verified the document's authenticity. It had been signed, witnessed, and recorded months before her death. A secondary witness, later revealed to be a retired Supreme Court justice, had confirmed the Queen's full awareness and intent at the time of its creation. There was no loophole, no ambiguity. The Queen had planned for every possible objection, and she had done so in silence. But the most haunting detail was the handwritten note included with the clause. Just one line: "My son may reign, but my legacy lives in them." It was a sentence that would be etched into royal history, and one that Charles, upon reading, could not bear. According to those present, he quietly folded the note, returned it to the envelope, and left Windsor without a word. Hours later, staff at Clarence House reported seeing him in tears, his first visible emotional collapse since the Queen's passing. No speech, no statement, just silence. The council itself was even more revealing. Alongside Catherine and William stood Princess Anne, unwavering, loyal to her mother's every word, and two unnamed advisors whose identities were kept classified in the official registry. There was speculation that one hailed from the Commonwealth, a quiet nod to the Queen's global reach, while the other was rumoured to be a financial strategist who once helped restructure royal trusts. The composition was strategic, designed not just to govern the estate, but to fortify it against interference from Parliament, from critics, and most painfully, from Charles himself. What began as a hidden clause had now become a sovereign fortress, built not of walls but of decisions, foresight, and deliberate distance. The Queen's choice was final, her words untouched, her silence thunderous. And while the Crown battled headlines and internal war, the estate that once defined Charles's personal sanctuary was now entirely beyond his grasp. But behind the legal twists and political fallout, something deeper was unraveling: the emotional bond between father and son. For a brief moment, the monarchy became just a family fractured, hurting, and unable to reconcile. William's silence was seen as betrayal. Charles's fury masked heartbreak. Palace staff witnessed emotional distance turn into cold avoidance. And yet, in public, the crown remained polished. But in private, father and son drifted beyond repair. Behind the gilded walls and rehearsed smiles, the fallout grew unbearable. Charles began cancelling engagements one after another, officially citing fatigue, but behind closed doors, insiders whispered another word: rage. The man who had waited his entire life to step into his role now found himself standing in the shadow of a legacy he no longer controlled. To the outside world, he appeared dutiful and measured. But within the palace, he was unravelling. Every corner of Highgrove reminded him of what had been taken, and every article mentioning George's inheritance felt like a fresh cut. He avoided Windsor. He refused contact. And William, sensing the emotional scorched earth before him, chose silence over confrontation. For weeks, William stayed away from Clarence's house, declining every invitation to meet, ignoring every attempt to reconcile. Not out of spite, but out of despair. Every path forward felt like betrayal. He had honoured his grandmother's wishes, protected his son, and yet in doing so he had broken something sacred between himself and his father. It was George, of course, who noticed first. Children see cracks long before adults admit they're there. One evening, with the innocence only a child can possess, George asked, "Did I do something wrong?" William had no answer, because the truth was far more complicated than a simple no and far too cruel to explain. Catherine, ever the peacemaker, tried to bridge the growing chasm. She reached out to Camilla, hoping a private dinner or quiet conversation could bring the two households together again. But Camilla, hardened by years of being sidelined and now humiliated by the Queen's final decree, shut her out entirely. No calls returned, no invitations offered. The palace had become two kingdoms, one ruled by silence, the other by grief, and in the middle stood George, a boy destined for greatness but surrounded by a family tearing at the seams. Late one night, William found himself alone in the royal archives, staring at a framed photo of his mother. In the silence, her voice echoed in his memory one phrase she'd repeated so often it was etched into his bones: "Be a better father than he was." William felt the full weight of that promise now. He hadn't just inherited a title, he'd inherited a pattern. And with each decision, he risked repeating the very wounds he swore to heal. And then, quietly, something unexpected happened. Charles, in one of his rare moments of solitude, penned a letter to George. No one knows what was written, not even William. The envelope was sealed, hand-delivered, and never discussed again. Some say it was an apology. Others believe it was a warning, but the look in George's eyes after reading it said everything he had seen aside of his grandfather no one else had. One softened not by crown but by pain. But fate wasn't finished with the Windsors yet, because the final move came from a place none of them expected: George himself. In a world dictated by power, tradition, and betrayal, the youngest among them chose compassion. George, barely a teenager, asked to speak at a family gathering. His words, simple yet profound, would change the tone of the royal conflict overnight. In his innocence, he reminded them all what legacy truly meant. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon, a private moment for a fractured family to share space, not words. But George, sensing the tension that adults tried so desperately to disguise, stood up with a calm only youth could carry and asked to speak. No one interrupted, not Charles, not William, not even Camilla. The room froze. And then he said it, without hesitation: "I want Highgrove for all of us." The simplicity of his message struck harder than any royal decree. In that moment, the property that had divided the monarchy became the very thing that offered it healing. George didn't see it as a battleground or a trophy. He saw it as home. Then, looking directly at Charles, he added, "I think Grandad should be there too, so he doesn't feel left out." Silence followed. But it wasn't the cold kind that had lingered for months. It was the kind that precedes something sacred, an emotional reckoning no document could enforce, no title could demand. William's hand slowly reached across the distance and rested on his father's shoulder. For the first time in months, father and son stood not as rivals in a broken chain, but as family linked by something deeper than power. Across the room, Catherine and Princess Anne locked eyes. No words passed between them, only tears, quiet, dignified, and full of something they hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Anne, the steel-hearted protector of tradition, and Catherine, the quiet guardian of the future, saw in George the one thing neither protocol nor legacy could manufacture: a bridge. Then came the moment that would never be captured by cameras or written into official record. Charles rose, walked toward his grandson, and without warning pulled him into a tight embrace. He whispered only one sentence: "You're stronger than all of us." And in that instant, the fury melted. Not forgotten, not erased, but softened. The family, once torn by ink and inheritance, agreed quietly, without press or proclamation, to rebalance. Highgrove would remain George's by right, but shared in spirit. The clause stood untouched, but its emotional sharpness dulled by something far more enduring than law: forgiveness. William and Charles didn't solve everything that day, but they found something better than resolution. They found the first step toward repair, in a kingdom of secrets. It was the voice of a child that broke the silence and reshaped a dynasty's future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.